Kriti Gupta is on the ground outside of that train station in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. Kriti, what do we know now about the ability of people in that area to move about?
Well, the irony, Romaine, is that just behind me, you do have the subway station is still closed, but the restaurants around it are actually open. So you do see some semblance of normalcy at a time when there is still a shooter on the loose that they are trying to essentially actively hunt down. You are also seeing schools in the area. Remember, this is an area where there are 4 schools that are still facing shelter-in-place orders. There are banks around here, some of which have been closed and barred up. There is also a park here. Romaine, Caroline, it's lunchtime. There should be a lot more traffic, and right now the only traffic you're seeing is simply through the street behind me that has finally opened up. There was a 20-block perimeter, and that has now been decreased slowly, but you are still seeing not a ton of movement when it comes to actually clearing the subway station in question.
And of course, Kriti, it takes about, 20 minutes from Wall Street to get to where you are, about 30 minutes from where we are in Upper East Side of Manhattan, a leafy suburb, as you say, surrounded by schools, surrounded by a multicultural community, a very strong Chinatown, for example, Latino community, and one that had been thriving, investment abound over there. What do we think of in terms of how we are suddenly seeing an activity on the ground, the focus on, of course, the immediacy of keeping people protected? What are some of the people saying that you're talking to?
Yeah, well, one of the big questions here is simply how you actually, in the short term, how you release some of these students from school. And that's going to be the major question in just a couple of hours when school actually is released. Right now, education is still going on. And from what I understand, they are actually expecting or trying to clear the subway by the end of the day. But once again, the clarity on that is still a little hazy. There will likely be another update throughout the day, but likely addressing some of those that were actually wounded in this attack. As far as normalcy goes, it's still unclear right now, Caroline and Romaine. You do have, like I said, a little bit of traffic, but you should see more. And right now, this area, alongside some of the other subway stations in New York, are still heavily armed. And that's something you're going to be seeing across subway stations in other major cities. Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, they've all have these armed presences now in light of, even though this was really considered of a one gunman acting alone, at least according to the NYPD.
And just give us a little bit of sense of the topography there. I know the 36th Street station, you're on 4th Avenue. It's a very busy commercial district, but I know on one side of you effectively have a beautiful park there in Sunset Park and a highly residential neighborhood, but to the other side you have a highway and then a somewhat commercial district that had been going through some redevelopment.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially what you're going to see is right behind me, you'll see some shot of the subway station if it's actually cleared, but you actually do have the park straight in front of me. You will have a school to the left of me, and of course a lot of residential properties. And this is why it's really interesting to see that this specific corner, yes, there is the entry to the subway station, but it's also very clearly a corner where a lot of people stop for food, where a lot of people drop their children off, and a lot of people can very easily access their homes or even go to the park. So this is, once again, a very active corner, and that's one of the concerns when it comes to why the gunman chose this particular station to actually release the canister and to actually make his escape, because this is known as a very busy area, not only below in the actual intersection of the D, N, and R lines, but also above when you have a very busy cross-section.
A very busy cross-section, of course, and indeed, we now focus our attention on when we might hear yet further updates coming from. We had, of course, the fire department's chief, Kavanaugh had spoken earlier, the first deputy commissioner there. We'd heard from the CEO of the MTA, John Miller, the deputy commissioner of intelligence and counterterrorism. But we know, of course, this is thus far not being investigated as a terrorist attack. And notably also the NYPD commissioner, 45th police commissioner, Keishan Sewell. When, Kriti, do we know if we'll get any further news on how those 16 people currently are that have been wounded, or indeed when we hear the next steps when it comes to evacuating children and ensuring that the area remains safe?
Yeah, well, in the last press conference, it was about 12 o'clock New York time, local time. You did hear them say in about 2 or 3 hours, we'll give you another update. That being said, the original press conference was delayed several hours as well. So you do want to keep an eye on the fact that that might not actually be true in terms of getting more information 2 or 3 hours from now. One of the big questions also, Caroline, to your earlier point, is the phrasing around this, because the NYPD, the fire department as well, said this is not an act of terrorism that you would potentially associate with, say, the likes of the 2017 Times Square underwear bombing. attempt, I should say. But you are also hearing Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, be very careful in his phrasing of this. He's not saying that it's an act of terrorism, but he is saying it's an act of terror. And that's going to be something in terms of the phrasing that we really want to keep an eye on, especially because when asked and pressed by some of the media, the New York Police Department did come out and say, well, we don't think it's an act of terror or terrorism, but we do think that we're not going to rule it out just yet. So that's going to be potentially, in addition to the situation of the folks that were critically injured, what this actually entails and what the motivation is. Hopefully there'll be some clarity on that in the next couple of hours.